everybody. My name is Lauren Ramsey with the Wise News Network, and today I'm here with Melinda Ratchford. She is a Titanic historian with a lot of knowledge and insight. So thank you, Melinda, for coming to join us.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah. So I know you have memories from the Titanic. You've been doing this for about 60 some years.
Yes,
Mhm.
and I know the first question I always get asked is, when did you fall in love with the Titanic?
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to do.
I was 10 years old in 1958, and I read Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember, and I highly recommend it. If you like the Titanic at all, it is the keystone book to read because he interviewed so many of the survivors. And then I guess the next time I ran into the Titanic was I was teaching in Greensboro, and I had 7th, 8th, and 9th graders, and the 7th and 8th graders were what I call reluctant learners. They were reluctant to be there, and most days I admit, reluctant to have them in my class. But I decided to do a Titanic complete study of the Titanic through science, math, English, history, the whole thing, and they fell in love with the Titanic, and this was back in the early 70s. So I had that opportunity, and then in 1996, I had the chance to go to the site of the Titanic and watch them try to bring up a piece of the Titanic. So I've been to Belfast, I've been to New York, I've been to Southampton, I've been to all the major sites, Washington, and I don't know. I feel like my mission is to tell her stories, and that's what I do. I've given over 300 presentations on the Titanic, and I never fail to find at least one person who has been part of the Titanic love for many years in each group.
So I know you mentioned the 300 presentations, which I find pretty interesting. Is there like a memorable or impactful moment that you can think of from doing one of those?
Yes, they're all memorable because I never, know if anybody's going to show up. And in fact, I was doing this down in a very small library in the eastern part of the state, and the librarian was tapping her foot. It was 6 o'clock and time to start, and there was nobody there. And I said, "Don't worry about it." I said, "I don't have to." She said, "Would you tape it?" And I said, "Well, sure." So about that time, a reporter came in, and so he was my sole audience of one while I taped my Titanic presentation. But there's always a hint of you never know who you're going to run into. I was in one of the mountain counties, and it was difficult to get to. Very small. In fact, we had 6 people to attend that night, which was fine. And as I talked and told the stories, and after it was over, one came up to me and she said, "You know, I think that my next door neighbor in South Dakota was on the Titanic." And I thought, how did you get to this mountainous town from South Dakota? And so she gave me the name of the gentleman. And I went home and got her information, of course, and looked him up, did a little research, and found out, yes, he was from Sweden, and he had come to settle in South Dakota with several Swedes that he had brought over. Some of them didn't make it on the Titanic. He did survive. So, you just never know when you're going to learn something new.
Yeah. So I know you've mentioned being at the Titanic at the sinking the site. So how did that come about? I heard that was Discovery Channel, right?
It was.
Yes.
They have done several of those, but this was their very first one. And so I got a letter in the mail saying, "Would you like to go see this?" And I told my husband, and he said, "Why would you want to do that, Melinda? It sank." And I thought, well, that's true. It did. But he said, "Why don't you go?" So I called 2 of my girlfriends, and I said, "Would y'all like to go on a cruise?" And they very sweetly, they did not know each other, said, "Well, yes." And so they called me back the next day and said, "Well, where are we going?" And I said, "Well," they said, "Are we going to the Bahamas, Bermuda, Mexico? Where is it?" And I said, "It's a little further north." And so God love them. I'll never forget them. They both went with me on that week-long cruise to the, site where the Titanic sank. We had Buzz Aldrin was on the ship, and he went down in the Nautil to see the Titanic. And so when he came back up, there were 500 of us in the audience, and we had a chance to ask him questions. And I said, what is the difference between you going to the Titanic and seeing the moon, being on the moon? And he said, you see the moon every night. He said, we just take it for granted there's the moon. He said, you can't compare the two, but I will say this, that when you go 2.5 miles down in the dark and you see nothing, it's total blackness until they put the lights on what's left of the Titanic. And he said, it takes your breath. And he said, I just know that I have seen two wonders of this world.
Oh, wow. That's really cool.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So in your research and collecting memorabilia, I can imagine you've come across like a lot of cool things. Is there an artifact or a piece of information that stands out to you when collecting things?
Again, you ask questions that I have to ponder. Everywhere I go, I look for something related to the Titanic. I had the opportunity to travel a lot. My husband and I were both in education, and so we would take off and go places. And I guess probably the thing that I found a first edition copy of a book that was put out 30 days after the sinking, and I have it, but it's not rare. I have a Limoges pill box that I bought in France that has the Titanic on it. It's very tiny, but that was unique. I have a big liquor bottle shaped like the Titanic, but when I bought it online, it was sent to me empty, so I don't know what liquor was in it. But just odd things. It's not anything valuable. I do own a piece of the coal, but you could buy that online too. But I make sure that every time I give a presentation, I pass that coal around so I can say to them, my audience, you have now touched a piece of history, because that coal was in the bunker on the Titanic and was spread out across the ocean floor when it sank.
That's really interesting. I did not know that. I like that. Okay. So with your knowledge of the Titanic, is there any like lesser known stories or overlooked details you feel like you've uncovered that maybe people don't know?
Well, I don't know that I've uncovered them, but my husband says I'm extraordinarily nosy. I like to say intellectually curious, but he's probably more right than I am. I find things that are coincidental. I find things that tie together. I taught history for many years, and I believe all the people that we talk about in history were once as alive as you and I are this very minute. And also, we travel this earth together, and we're all connected. You just have to find the connection. I am in the process of finishing a book for the History Press in Gloucestershire, England, and it will be 16 stories about women on the Titanic. And so I'm hoping that it's to be published in April of 2026 in England. But I found these women, and I studied their stories, and I took the ones that spoke to me. And so that's how I arrived at the 16. Some of them are not well known, some of them are, but I just think that you find the connection. Why were those people on the Titanic? What was the rest of their life like? And what was their life like before the Titanic?
That's really cool. I think that is really interesting to know part of history. So thank you for telling me this. This is really interesting.
Good.
Yeah. So I know the Titanic has a lot of conspiracy theories. So like there was one about the Odyssey, the sister ship was the one that sank, which we all know is not true. Can you maybe tell me about it?
Well, I don't know what it is. I guess we all love a good conspiracy theory. There were several. On the Titanic, it was the fact that the Titanic was really not the Titanic, but it was the Olympic, and they did it for insurance purposes. And if that were true, that didn't work out well for the people who owned the Titanic, the White Star Line. There are conspiracy theories like there was an Egyptian mummy on the Titanic. Well, I've looked at every bill of lading for the Titanic, and strangely, it doesn't mention one mummy being on that ship. There was that little Renault car that was in the movie, Cameron's Titanic movie. There really was a car, but it was cased up. So, the story that was told would not have happened in actual fact. So there's lots of little things that people like to talk about. And I always get the question, who was Jack a real person on the boat? And I have to break some hearts because I tell them, no, Rose nor Jack were real. They were the creations of James Cameron. And then come to find out that there was a John Dawson on the Titanic. He was a trimmer. He went around and trimmed the lights on and off. And he was part of the crew. And he is buried. His body was recovered, and he's buried in Nova Scotia. And you will find some odd things on his gravesite that ladies have left in his memory. They think it's him, but it's really not.
Well, that's interesting. So the Titanic has inspired people for many generations. So as someone who's spent so much time in its history, what do you hope people take away from its story?
That we are all like the people represented on Titanic. Titanic was, yes, a floating palace, but perhaps more importantly, it was a microcosm of society. It was the only place in the world, an ocean liner at that time, where you would have people of first class and people of steerage, third class, who were actually on the same ship. And the interaction among those people was very stilted. If you were first class, you stayed in first class. If you were second class, that just simply meant you didn't get a ticket in first class many times. You were wealthy enough, but you were what we would call middle class today. And then the third class, that was where the liners, the companies, made their money because there were thousands of people that were leaving Europe and going to America. And the people who had these luxury ships decided, wow, we can make a lot of money. But being on third class on the Titanic was equal to being on second class in any other ship of its time. So it just shows you that when you're on that ship, the old saying, we're all in the same boat is very true. And I don't believe that anybody asks what class you are as the ship's going down.
So thank you for your time, Melinda.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed this.
I've enjoyed this too. This is really interesting. I think people will really enjoy the history. So
I hope so. And read every Titanic book you can get your hands on.
Yeah. So that's all for today, everybody. For now, I am Lauren Ramsey with the Wise News Network.